and thank the witnesses very much. Just a slight moment down memory lane, Ms. Goteen. Something called COINTELPRO. I won't ask you to get in the weeds, but it was used extensively against Dr. Martin Luther King and the whole landscape of civil rights activists and workers to give minimal liberties to African Americans during the 1950s and 60s. And so here we are again with what was needed to be able to protect Americans. And I think it's important to indicate that the process was that if there was communication and it was with a foreign operative, foreign citizen, the FBI for Americans would not be targeting you, not supposed to be, but we're targeting that foreign citizen or the communications thereof. How did we mess up so badly?
Wow, that's a tough question. What I would say is that FISA, as enacted in 1978, required the government to obtain an individualized court order showing probable cause that the target of surveillance was a foreign power or an agent of foreign power when domestically placing a wiretap to collect communications between even foreign targets and Americans. And that was to safeguard the Americans' constitutional rights that they have in that communication. What Section 702 did is it got rid of that requirement. And it enabled the government to say that as long as it's targeting a foreigner, we don't really have to worry so much about the Americans' constitutional rights. Now, that's not actually what Section 702 says. It says, you're going to pull this in, the American side of the communications, but you should minimize it. You should delete it. You should not share it. Unfortunately, that's not what has happened.
So that is, that's a crux of one of the elements of the problem.
Absolutely.
There, this mountain piles up and no one feels any compulsion, not compelled to say, let me immediately send it into the incinerator, throw it into the trash, get rid of it, shred it, etc. Doesn't happen.
Right, and even if the FBI comes across Americans' information or other agencies, NSA, CIA, that doesn't even seem to be foreign intelligence or evidence of a crime, they pretty much never get rid of it until it reaches the age-off deadline, which is 5 years. It's 5 years with a lot of exceptions. So it's 5 years or in many cases much longer.
Let me try to hone in on what Americans may be impacted by with respect to these cases. In this pile of information in which an agency has not complied with the guidelines that Congress put in place and or their own policies. To your knowledge, is the evidence found, or has the evidence found in this way, typically excluded in a criminal case?
Well, in most criminal cases, the government doesn't give the notice to criminal defendants that is required under FISA. There's been a long pattern of the government evading its notice obligations. And if the defendant doesn't know that FISA has been used, that Section 702 has been used in that defendant's case, there's no way the defendant can raise a challenge, let alone have the evidence excluded. And most likely the way that the government has been avoiding this notice obligation is through parallel construction, which is a well-documented practice of essentially recreating the evidence using less controversial means. So one of the things that Congress should do if and when it reauthorizes Section 702 is to prohibit parallel construction. If I could quickly speak to Congressman Gates's question, I think the problem with simply letting Section 702 expire is that...
I will allow you to do so. The chairman's going to give me a little bit more time to be able to answer.
No.
But if you'll go quickly.
I'll go very quickly. Is that Congress will then lose the opportunity to make necessary reforms to other surveillance authorities and to close gaps that are in those authorities that allow the government to operate without any statutory authority at all. And if Congress merely lets Section 702 expire, the government will shift its surveillance activities to these other methods.
So let me quickly get from you the singular change, other than what we just talked about, parallel construction, that we should be looking at.
Gentlelady's time's expired, but you may answer that question.
If I have any message for you today at all, it's that you cannot just go with one singular change. A warrant requirement for backdoor searches is necessary. It is far from sufficient. There are other reforms that need to be made, not only to Section 702, but also to overseas surveillance that currently happens without any statutory authority, to the practice of purchasing Fourth Amendment protected information from data brokers, and several other reforms that I mentioned in my written testimony.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. I recognize the gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Tiffany.